The phone rang just after midnight, the kind of ring that cuts through sleep and settles straight into your chest. I remember staring at the screen, my heart already racing before I even saw his name. My son never called at this hour unless something was wrong. He was a pilot, disciplined, calm, trained to handle emergencies without panic. So when I answered and heard his voice shaking, I knew this wasn't routine. He didn't start with hello. He didn't ask how I was. He went straight to the words that would change everything. "Mom," he said, almost whispering, "this is impossible. She's on my flight, not at home." For a moment, I couldn't even understand what he meant. My mind tried to catch up, searching for logic where none seemed to exist. I asked him to slow down, to explain, but he was breathing hard, like he had just run up a flight of stairs. I could hear the background noise of an airport, distant announcements, footsteps, metal wheels rolling on the floor. He told me he was in the cockpit, preparing for a late-night flight, going through his routine checks. Everything had been normal, too normal, until he stepped out briefly and glanced down the aisle of the plane. That was when he saw her. He said his whole body froze. His hands went cold. For a split second, he thought he was imagining things, that exhaustion was playing tricks on him. Pilots work long hours. The human brain can misfire under stress. That's what he told himself. But the longer he looked, the more certain he became. There she was, sitting quietly by the window, seatbelt unfastened, hands folded in her lap. The same face, the same hair, the same jacket she was supposed to be wearing at home. I asked him who she was, even though something deep inside me already knew. My voice sounded far away, like it wasn't mine. When he said her name, my stomach dropped. It was the last person on Earth who should have been on that plane. The last person who could explain why she was there. And the last person he ever expected to see at 35,000 feet. He told me he had spoken to her just hours earlier. She had been at home, or at least she was supposed to be. They had argued, nothing serious, just one of those small disagreements that couples have and forget by morning. She had said she was tired and wanted to be alone. He left for his shift thinking everything was fine. Annoying maybe, but fine. And now she was somehow sitting on his flight, acting as if this was completely normal. I tried to calm him down. I told him maybe she'd changed her plans. Maybe she decided to surprise him. But even as I said the words, they felt hollow. My son knows schedules. He knows manifests. He knows security. Passengers don't just appear on a flight by accident, especially not without him knowing. And there was something else in his voice, something heavier than confusion.
Fear.
He said she hadn't looked at him. Not once.
Not when he passed by.
Not when he stood only a few steps away. It was like she didn't see him at all, or worse, like she was pretending not to. He wanted to call out to her, to ask what was going on, but his training kicked in. He was on duty. He had a responsibility to the passengers, to the crew, to the plane itself. So he went back into the cockpit, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his checklist. I sat there on the edge of my bed, clutching the phone, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. As a mother, you spend your life worrying about your children, but nothing prepares you for the moment when your grown son sounds like a scared little boy again. I wanted to tell him to come home, to walk off the plane, to forget the flight. But life doesn't work that way. Not for pilots. Not for people who carry hundreds of lives with them into the sky. He told me he checked the passenger list again. Her name was there.
Clear as day.
No mistake. No typo. It was officially her. And yet, according to everything he knew, she was supposed to be asleep in their bed, miles away from the airport. That contradiction kept looping in his mind, over and over, until it felt like his head might split. I asked him what he planned to do. He paused for a long time before answering. He said the crew was finishing boarding. The door would close soon. Once they pushed back from the gate, there would be no turning around. He said part of him wanted to confront her right there, in front of everyone. Another part of him was terrified of what she might say, or what she might not say at all. Because if she could be there without telling him, then what else didn't he know? As he spoke, I realized this wasn't just about a woman on a plane.
It was about trust.
About the fragile line between what we believe and what is real. About how quickly a normal night can turn into something unrecognizable. My son had spent years learning how to navigate storms in the sky, but nothing had prepared him for the storm forming inside his own life. Just before we ended the call, his voice dropped even lower. He told me something he hadn't noticed at first. When he finally looked back down the aisle one last time, she had turned her head slightly, just enough for him to see her face clearly. And for a brief second, their eyes met. He said there was no surprise in her expression. No guilt. No warmth. Just a calm, unreadable look, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. Then the captain called him back to his seat. The engines were starting. The flight was about to take off. He told me he would call me when they landed if he could. The line went silent, leaving me alone with questions that had no answers yet. Who was she really meeting? Why had she hidden this from him? And what was waiting for him at the other end of that flight? As I stared at the dark screen of my phone, one thought kept echoing in my mind. This story was only just beginning, and whatever the truth was, it was about to change everything. The hours after that call stretched longer than any night I could remember. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, replaying his words, hearing the fear he tried so hard to hide. Every few minutes, I checked my phone, half expecting another call, half dreading it. As a mother, you learn to read between your child's sentences, to hear what they don't say.
And what my son didn't say scared me more than what he did.
To understand why this shook him so deeply, you need to know who my son is. He has always been steady, even as a child. While other kids panicked, he stayed calm. When he decided to become a pilot, it felt natural, like the sky had been calling him all along. He trained for years, sacrificed holidays, missed birthdays, all for the discipline and responsibility that comes with flying.
Rules mattered to him.
Order mattered. His life was built on checklists and trust in systems that don't leave room for surprises. And then there was her. They met years ago, long before his first command. She was lively, sharp, and full of energy that balanced his quiet nature. I remember the first time he brought her home. She smiled easily, asked thoughtful questions, and looked at my son like he was the safest place in the world. I believed in them. Everyone did. They weren't perfect, but they were solid.
Or so it seemed.
That's why this situation felt so wrong. She hated flying at night. She once told me it made her anxious, that she preferred to be asleep in her own bed while planes crossed the sky above her. She avoided airports whenever she could. So the idea of her calmly sitting on a late-night flight, without a word to her own pilot husband, didn't fit the person we thought we knew. As the plane climbed into the dark sky, my son did what he had been trained to do. He focused on the instruments. Altitude.
Speed.
Fuel. Every number was where it should be. The aircraft was steady. The weather was clear. From the outside, it was a perfect flight. Inside, his thoughts were anything but. He kept seeing her face in his mind, the way she hadn't reacted, the way her eyes held something distant and unreadable. He told me later that he kept asking himself the same questions over and over. Had she been planning this for weeks? Was it a coincidence that she was on his flight, or had she chosen it deliberately? And if she had, why stay silent? Why not send a message, make a call, leave some trace of explanation? The silence felt heavier than any argument they had ever had. Meanwhile, I was back home, surrounded by memories that suddenly felt fragile. Their wedding photo on the shelf. Family dinners. Laughing conversations that now felt like scenes from another life. I tried to remind myself that there might be a simple explanation. Maybe she was visiting a friend. Maybe she didn't want to worry him before takeoff. But every explanation I came up with fell apart the moment I remembered his words. She's supposed to be at home. Time moved strangely that night. Minutes dragged, then vanished. I imagined my son in the cockpit, staring straight ahead while his life quietly shifted behind the locked door. I imagined her sitting among strangers, looking out the window at the same darkness, carrying secrets I couldn't begin to understand. The distance between them wasn't measured in rows or feet, but in unanswered questions. What troubled me most was the look he described. Not shock. Not fear. Just calm. As if she knew something he didn't. That kind of calm doesn't come from impulse. It comes from decision. And that thought settled into my chest like a stone. As the flight continued, my son noticed small details he hadn't paid attention to before. She didn't use her phone. She didn't talk to the passenger beside her. When the cabin crew passed by, she thanked them politely, her voice steady, almost rehearsed. It was like she was playing a role, and playing it well. That only deepened his confusion. If this was a secret, she was guarding it carefully. Back at home, I finally stood up and paced the room. The night felt too quiet. Every ticking sound, every creak of the house felt louder. I kept thinking about how quickly trust can crack without anyone noticing. You don't hear it break. You feel it, slowly, like ice thinning beneath your feet. One moment you're standing on solid ground, the next you're questioning everything you believed. I wondered if I should reach out to her, send a message, ask if she was okay. But something stopped me. If she wanted to be found, she wouldn't have hidden. And if she didn't, then my message would only add pressure without answers. So I waited, trapped between worry and restraint, like a passenger in my own kind of flight, unable to move. As the plane crossed state lines, my son's mind drifted back to the past. Small moments that now felt different under this new light. Late nights when she said she was working. Sudden changes in plans. Distractions he brushed off as stress or fatigue. None of it meant anything on its own. But together, they formed a pattern he hadn't wanted to see. Yet even with all those doubts, there was still love. That was the hardest part. Love doesn't disappear the moment confusion arrives. It lingers, making every unanswered question hurt more deeply. He didn't want to believe she was hiding something serious. He wanted to believe there was a reason that would make sense, one that wouldn't tear their life apart. When the captain announced they were beginning their descent, my phone buzzed with a short message from my son. Just a few words. Landing soon. I don't know what to think. I stared at the screen, wishing I had the right words to send back, something that could steady him the way he steadied his aircraft. But there are moments when no advice fits. As the plane prepared to touch down, the tension hadn't eased. If anything, it grew heavier. Because landing wouldn't bring answers. It would bring decisions. Would he confront her? Would she finally speak? Or would she walk past him like a stranger, carrying her mystery into the crowd? I stood by the window, watching the dark sky, imagining that plane somewhere out there, descending with its silent secret still intact. Whatever waited at the gate, I knew one thing for certain. The truth was closer now, but it wasn't ready to reveal itself. And when it did, nothing about their lives would ever feel simple again. When the plane finally touched down, my son said it felt like the longest few seconds of his life. The tires met the runway smoothly, just another routine landing to anyone watching from the outside. Passengers clapped softly, unaware that for one man in the cockpit, the real turbulence was only beginning. As the aircraft slowed and taxied toward the gate, his focus slipped for the first time in years. He wasn't thinking about procedures or post-flight checklists. He was thinking about the woman sitting just a few rows behind the cockpit door and what this landing would force him to face. From my side of the world, I felt that moment too. I stood in my kitchen, staring at the clock, imagining the plane rolling closer to the terminal. I wondered what I would do if I were in his place. Would I confront her immediately, driven by shock and emotion? Or would I wait, hoping for clarity, before saying something that couldn't be taken back? As a mother, I wanted to protect him from pain. As a realist, I knew some pain can't be avoided. When the seatbelt sign turned off, the cabin filled with movement. Bags opened. People stood. Conversations resumed. Normal life rushed back in. My son stayed seated, listening to the noise through the cockpit door, each sound pulling tighter at his nerves. He knew she would walk past that door soon. There was no avoiding it now. No more distance. No more imagining. Just reality, raw and unavoidable. But something unexpected happened. She didn't rush to stand like the others. She stayed seated, letting the line move forward without her. One by one, passengers passed the cockpit, thanking the crew, smiling, stretching after the flight. She remained behind, as if waiting for the right moment, or maybe avoiding it altogether. That small decision, that pause, told him more than words ever could. It felt deliberate. From her point of view, the flight had been quiet. That's what he imagined later. Maybe she had spent the hours thinking, preparing, rehearsing what she might say. Or maybe she was running from something she didn't know how to face yet. He realized then that whatever was happening wasn't just about him. It was about something larger, something that had been building long before that night. When the cabin finally emptied, my son stepped out. The aisle was almost silent now, the hum of airport activity distant. She stood up slowly, adjusted her bag, and turned toward him. This time, she didn't look away. Their eyes met again, and the space between them felt heavier than the entire flight. He said neither of them spoke at first. No anger, no accusations, just a shared pause filled with everything unsaid. I imagined that moment over and over, trying to picture her expression, his posture, the way years of shared life stood quietly between them. He told me later that her face looked tired, not guilty, not defensive, just tired. And that scared him more than any argument would have. Tired people carry long stories. Around them, the airport moved on. Announcements echoed. Carts rolled by. People hugged and rushed to connections. But for those few seconds, it felt like time had narrowed down to just the two of them. Finally, she spoke his name, softly, like she wasn't sure how it would sound anymore. He answered, but his voice didn't feel like his own. They didn't talk there. Not really. Too many ears. Too many eyes. She told him she needed a little time, that they would talk soon, just not here. Then she walked past him, blending into the crowd, leaving him standing alone in uniform, surrounded by strangers who had no idea what had just happened. When he called me after, his voice was calm in a way that worried me. Calm can be a shield. He told me what happened, every detail, every pause. I listened without interrupting, letting him empty his thoughts the only way he could. He kept saying the same thing. Something's wrong, Mom. I just don't know how wrong yet. In the days that followed, the silence grew louder. She didn't come home right away. She said she was staying with a friend, needing space to think. My son returned to work, flying routes like nothing had changed, but everything had. Every time he walked through an airport, every time he scanned a passenger list, he felt a flicker of anxiety he had never known before. Trust, once cracked, makes even familiar places feel unstable. From her side, pieces of a different story began to surface. Not answers, but hints. Conversations she avoided. Questions she deflected. Friends who suddenly seemed uncomfortable when his name came up. It was like looking at a photograph that had been torn into pieces, with no clear picture yet of what it once was. I found myself caught in the middle, loving them both, trying not to choose sides before there was something clear to choose. I replayed past conversations with her, searching for signs I might have missed. Was there something she had wanted to say but never did? Was this flight a breaking point, or just the moment the truth finally surfaced? What made it harder was the waiting. The human mind fills silence with its own stories, and those stories are rarely kind. My son wrestled with doubts late at night, wondering if this was about him, his long absences, his dedication to a career that often came before everything else. Or if it was about something entirely separate, something she had carried alone. The main conflict wasn't just about why she was on that flight. It was about how two people who loved each other could suddenly feel like strangers. It was about secrets and timing, about the space between intention and action. And every unanswered question added another layer of tension, another reason to fear what the truth might bring. Even now, as I tell this part of the story, that moment at the gate still hangs in the air. A quiet confrontation, without resolution. A mystery that deepened instead of clearing. My son continues to fly, continues to smile for passengers, continues to live in two worlds at once. One in the sky, where everything is controlled and predictable, and one on the ground, where nothing feels certain anymore. And somewhere in between those worlds is a woman who boarded a plane without explanation, carrying a secret that has yet to be spoken. A secret that waits, patiently, for the moment when it can no longer stay hidden. The days that followed felt heavier than the night of the flight itself. It's strange how waiting can be more exhausting than action. Every morning my son woke up hoping for clarity, and every night he went to bed with the same unanswered questions. He replayed that moment at the gate over and over, her tired eyes, the way she said his name, the careful distance she kept. Nothing about it felt accidental anymore. She finally agreed to talk, but not right away. She said she needed time to gather her thoughts. That phrase alone was enough to unsettle him. When people need time to think, it usually means the truth is complicated or painful, or both. He respected her request, at least on the surface, but inside, his patience was wearing thin. Pilots are trained to act, to respond, to make decisions under pressure. This kind of emotional holding pattern was unfamiliar territory. From my perspective, watching him go through this was heartbreaking. He tried to keep his routine, but little cracks began to show. He was quieter, distracted. He double-checked things that never needed checking. At dinner, he would pause mid-sentence, lost in thought. I knew he was searching for answers that hadn't come yet. Meanwhile, the mystery around her only deepened. He noticed unfamiliar numbers on the phone bill. Messages that ended abruptly when he walked into the room. Small things, subtle enough to explain away, but together they formed a growing sense of unease. Trust doesn't shatter all at once. It erodes, grain by grain. The night before they were finally supposed to meet and talk, he barely slept. He told me later that his mind raced through every possible scenario. Was she going to confess something he wasn't ready to hear? Was she going to deny everything and make him question his own instincts? Or worse, was she going to reveal something that would explain the flight, but change how he saw their entire life together? As the meeting time approached, tension hung thick in the air. He chose a quiet place, neutral ground, away from home, away from work. Somewhere they could speak without interruption. I could hear the strain in his voice when he called me beforehand. He said he felt like he was preparing for turbulence he couldn't see on any radar. From her side, the silence had meaning too. She arrived late, which only added to his anxiety. Every minute felt deliberate, as if she was building courage or bracing herself. When she finally walked in, he said she looked different. Not in appearance, but in presence. Like someone carrying weight they hadn't put down in a long time. They sat across from each other, and for a moment neither spoke. The hum of the room faded into the background. This was it. The point where everything could change. He asked her the question that had haunted him since that night. Why were you on my flight? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a deep breath, the kind people take before stepping into cold water. She told him there were things she hadn't known how to say. Things she thought she could handle on her own. Her words were careful, measured, like she was choosing each one to avoid breaking something fragile. As she spoke, my son felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that she wasn't denying the obvious. Dread, because he could sense that whatever was coming next wasn't simple. The story wasn't about a single decision or a sudden mistake. It was layered, tied to choices made quietly over time. She mentioned the flight again, how she chose it deliberately, how she knew he would be there. That alone sent a chill through him. Choosing his flight meant this wasn't just about travel. It was about confrontation, or closure, or something unresolved that had finally reached a breaking point. But even then, she stopped short of explaining everything. He pressed gently at first, then more firmly. He asked the questions that had kept him awake. Who were you going to see? Why didn't you tell me? What are you afraid to say? With each question, the air between them grew tighter. She answered some things vaguely, avoided others entirely. It was like circling the truth without touching it. From where I stood, hearing his account later, I could feel the tension rising. This wasn't a dramatic argument. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors.
It was quieter than that.
And quiet moments like these are often the most dangerous because they force you to listen to what's underneath the words. At one point, she looked at him and said something that stuck with him. She said, "I didn't plan for it to come out this way." That sentence alone carried so many implications. It suggested intention. It suggested secrets. It suggested that the night flight wasn't the beginning of the story, but the moment it could no longer stay hidden. As they talked, my son realized something else. This wasn't just about her choices. It was about distance that had grown between them without either fully noticing. His long hours. Her quiet struggles. Conversations postponed for later that never came. The flight had forced everything into the open, but the cracks had been there long before. Still, the biggest question remained unanswered. The core of the mystery stayed just out of reach. She hinted at responsibility, at timing, at consequences she was afraid of. But she didn't cross the line into full truth. Not yet. And that restraint, that hesitation, kept the tension alive. When they finally stood up to leave, nothing was resolved. If anything, the weight had increased. He walked away knowing more than he had before, but not enough to feel grounded. She walked away knowing she would have to say more soon, whether she was ready or not. That night, my son called me again. His voice was steady, but underneath it, I could hear the storm building. He said the truth was close now. He could feel it. And whatever it was going to change everything one way or another. As I ended the call, I stared at the dark outside my window, thinking about that first moment he called me from the cockpit. Impossible, he had said. Now, nothing felt impossible anymore. The pieces were moving into place, slowly, deliberately. And the closer they came together, the more certain I was that the moment of impact was near. After that call, I thought we were braced for whatever truth was coming. I was wrong. The next twist didn't arrive with a confession or an argument. It arrived quietly, slipping into my son's life the same way that flight had, unexpected, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. 2 days after their meeting, my son was back at the airport for another scheduled flight. He told himself to focus, to keep his personal life separate from his work. That had always been his strength. But as he reviewed the passenger manifest, something made his chest tighten. A familiar name appeared again. Not hers this time, but someone connected to her. Someone she had mentioned only once, casually, in passing, months earlier. At the time it meant nothing. Now it felt like a warning bell. He checked it twice, then a third time, hoping it was coincidence. Airports are full of common names, after all. But this one wasn't common. And the timing was too precise to ignore. His heart began to race, not from fear of flying, but from the realization that whatever she was dealing with hadn't ended with that first flight. It was still moving, still unfolding. When he boarded the plane, his senses felt sharper than usual. Every face stood out. Every movement felt loaded with meaning. He didn't see the person immediately, but the knowledge that they were there changed everything. It was like being aware of turbulence ahead, without knowing when it would hit. From my side, I sensed something was off the moment he called me later that evening. His voice was tense, clipped. He asked me questions that seemed unrelated at first. Had I ever met this person? Did I remember her mentioning them before? Was there anything about that time in their life that stood out to me now? Each question pulled at threads I hadn't thought about in years. Then he told me about the passenger list, about the name, about the feeling that this wasn't random anymore. The story was getting bigger, stretching beyond just the two of them. And when stories grow like that, they tend to bring consequences no one planned for. That night, he confronted her again, this time not gently. He asked her directly why this person was suddenly appearing in his professional world. Her reaction said more than her words ever could. She froze. Not in shock, but in recognition. Like someone who knows the game is almost up. That silence, that pause before she spoke, was louder than any denial. She told him there were connections he didn't understand yet. That she hadn't wanted him involved. That bringing this into his work life was never part of her plan. But plans change when secrets start colliding with reality. And this one had crossed a line neither of them could ignore anymore. As she spoke, pieces began to shift in his mind. The late nights, the sudden trips, the emotional distance that couldn't be blamed solely on his schedule. This wasn't just about hiding something personal. It was about protecting something fragile, something that could unravel if exposed too soon. The stakes rose quickly after that. My son began to worry not just about his marriage, but about his career. Pilots live under strict rules. Any distraction, any unresolved personal issue, can become a professional risk. He found himself questioning whether this situation could follow him into the cockpit again, whether it could compromise the one place in his life where control mattered most. Meanwhile, she became more withdrawn. She stopped answering calls promptly. Conversations grew shorter, more guarded. It was clear she was running out of room to maneuver. Whatever she was holding back was no longer contained. It was spilling into places she had tried to keep separate. From where I stood, it felt like watching two paths race toward the same intersection. One built on honesty and trust, the other on fear and delay. And somewhere in the middle was a truth that refused to stay hidden. Then came the moment that truly escalated everything. My son received an unexpected message, not from her, but from someone else entirely. Someone who knew more than they should have. Someone who referenced that first flight, the late-night call, the impossible moment that had started it all. The message was brief, almost casual, but its meaning was anything but. It made one thing painfully clear. This story was no longer private. As he stared at his phone, reading those words again and again, the weight of the situation finally settled in. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a secret kept too long. It was a chain of choices now intersecting with real lives, real careers, and real consequences. When he called me that night, there was no confusion left in his voice. Only resolve mixed with fear. He said the truth was coming whether anyone was ready or not. That the next conversation would change everything. And that once it did, there would be no going back to how things were before that flight. As I hung up, my hands trembled. I thought back to his first call, the disbelief, the shock. We were far past that now. The mystery had deepened, the stakes had risen, and the calm before the storm was over. Whatever was about to be revealed wasn't just going to explain why she was on that flight. It was going to expose why she never should have been there in the first place. The final conversation happened sooner than any of us expected. There was no more space left for delays, no room to hide behind careful words. The message my son had received made that clear. Someone else knew. Someone else was watching. Whatever this was, it had outgrown silence. They met again, this time at home. The place that once felt safe now felt like neutral territory, stripped of comfort by unanswered questions. The air was heavy the moment she walked in. My son said he could feel it in his chest, like standing at the edge of something irreversible. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply asked her to tell him the truth, all of it, starting with that flight. She sat down slowly, as if her body already knew what her mind had accepted. When she spoke, her voice shook, not with fear of him, but with the weight of what she had been carrying. She told him the flight wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't about another person in the way he feared. It was about her past. A part of her life she thought she had left behind, but never fully closed. Years ago, before they met, she had been involved in something she wasn't proud of. Nothing illegal, nothing dangerous, but deeply personal. A responsibility she walked away from when she wasn't ready to face it. She built a new life, believing distance and time would erase what she left undone. For a while it worked, then someone from that past reached out. Quietly at first, then persistently. They weren't asking for money or favors. They wanted answers. Closure. They wanted her to show up. The flight wasn't about running away from my son. It was about finally confronting something she had avoided for years. She chose his flight because she felt safest there. Because being close to him, even without telling him, gave her courage. She admitted she knew how wrong that was. She knew it crossed a line. But fear doesn't always make logical choices. Sometimes it clings to whatever feels familiar. My son listened without interrupting. Piece by piece, the story came together. The late nights. The sudden distance. The other name on the passenger list. It wasn't a secret relationship. It was a reckoning. Something unfinished demanding to be seen. When she finished, the room went quiet. The main conflict that had torn at him for days finally had shape. It wasn't betrayal in the way he imagined, but it was still a breach of trust. She had made a choice that pulled him into a storm without warning. That hurt didn't disappear just because the explanation made sense.
He told her that.
Calmly. Honestly. He told her love doesn't erase the need for truth. That being a pilot taught him something important. Ignoring warning signs doesn't prevent disaster. It just delays it. If she had trusted him enough to tell him, they could have faced it together. She cried then, quietly, not defensively. She said she didn't want to burden him, that she was afraid he would see her differently. Afraid that the life they built would crack under the weight of who she used to be. But keeping it hidden did exactly that. In that moment, the biggest questions were answered. Why she was on the flight. Why she stayed silent. Why the tension followed them everywhere. The mystery finally had a core. And with it came a fragile sense of relief. The truth was painful, but it was real. They talked long into the night. Not everything was fixed. Trust doesn't rebuild itself in a single conversation. But something shifted. The constant dread eased. The feeling of being hunted by the unknown faded. For the first time since that late-night call, my son felt grounded again. He called me the next morning and told me everything. I could hear the exhaustion in his voice, but also something steadier underneath it. He said they were going to take time, real time, to decide what came next. There were no promises, no quick resolutions. Just honesty, finally out in the open. I thought that was the end of it. The climax. The truth revealed. The storm passed. But life rarely ends stories so neatly. A few days later, my son received another message. This one wasn't threatening. It wasn't secretive. It was short and direct. The person who had reached out to her wanted to speak to him too. Not to accuse. Not to interfere. But to explain their side of the story. That request unsettled him more than he expected. Because it meant there was still a perspective he hadn't heard. Still a piece missing from the full picture. And suddenly, the sense of closure he felt began to loosen at the edges. He realized then that while the main conflict between them had been brought into the light, the ripple effects were still moving outward. Other lives, other truths, other consequences that hadn't surfaced yet. As he stood in the kitchen reading that message, the same feeling from the cockpit returned. That quiet awareness that something else was coming. Something that might not change what he knew, but could change how he understood it. He hasn't answered the message yet. And as a mother, watching from the outside, I've learned something through all of this. Sometimes the biggest twists don't undo the truth. They deepen it. They remind us that every story has layers, and just when you think you've reached the end, life turns one more page. Because that flight wasn't just about where she was going. It was about everything that followed after landing. The waiting didn't last forever. A few days later, my son agreed to meet the person who had sent that message. Not out of anger and not out of obligation, but because he finally understood something important. If he wanted real closure, he couldn't build it on half-truths. Flying had taught him that you don't ignore loose ends. You trace them one by one until the picture is clear. They met in a quiet public place. Nothing dramatic, nothing hidden. The person he met wasn't what he expected. Not threatening. Not manipulative. Just someone carrying their own history, their own unanswered questions. And slowly, calmly, the last pieces of the story came together. Years ago, before my son was part of her life, she had made a choice she wasn't ready for at the time. A choice that shaped someone else's life as much as her own. That person wasn't seeking revenge or control. They were seeking understanding. Time had passed, but time doesn't erase questions. It only teaches patience. The late-night flight, the silence, the fear, it all traced back to that moment in her past when she chose distance instead of confrontation. When life circled back, she panicked. She thought she could manage it alone. She thought she was protecting the life she had built. Instead, she nearly lost it. When my son came home that evening, he looked lighter. Not because everything was perfect, but because nothing was hidden anymore. The mystery that once felt overwhelming had been reduced to something human and flawed. Painful, yes, but real. He told her about the meeting. He didn't keep it from her. That was the first real change. Transparency replaced fear. They talked again, this time without walls. She admitted how much shame had shaped her silence. He admitted how deeply the secrecy had shaken his trust. Neither of them tried to rush forgiveness. They didn't promise outcomes they couldn't guarantee. What they did promise was honesty. The days that followed were quieter. No dramatic confrontations. No sudden decisions.
Just slow rebuilding.
Trust doesn't return all at once. It shows up in small moments. A shared meal, a conversation without defensiveness, a willingness to answer hard questions without walking away. For my son, returning to the cockpit felt different too. The sky was the same, the aircraft unchanged, but his perspective had shifted. He realized how easily personal storms can follow you into professional spaces if left unaddressed. He became more intentional, more aware of balance. Control, he learned, isn't about holding everything tightly. It's about knowing when to let others in. As for her, facing the past didn't erase the years she spent avoiding it, but it gave those years context. She stopped running. She took responsibility where it was needed. Not perfectly, but sincerely. That mattered more than grand gestures ever could. From my place as a mother, I watched them both grow in ways I hadn't expected. I saw how quickly certainty can dissolve and how slowly understanding returns. I learned that love doesn't always break loudly. Sometimes it cracks quietly, and healing happens the same way. Eventually, life found a new rhythm. Not the old one, untouched and easy, but a more honest one. They chose to move forward together, aware that choosing each other now meant something deeper than it had before. They didn't pretend the flight never happened. They acknowledged it as a turning point. That late-night call, the word impossible, the shock that followed, it all became part of their story. Not as a wound, but as a lesson. A reminder that secrets don't stay buried, and that silence can be louder than truth. Looking back, I realized that flight changed more than one life. It changed how we all see trust, timing, and courage. It showed us that confronting the past isn't about reopening old pain, but about finally letting it rest. When my son calls me now, his voice is steady again. Not because life is free of uncertainty, but because he knows how to face it. And every time I hear a plane pass overhead late at night, I think of that moment when everything seemed impossible. Sometimes the most unsettling journeys aren't measured in miles or altitude. They're measured in honesty. And sometimes, the safest landing doesn't happen on a runway. It happens when the truth finally comes home.